The chandeliers sparkled like stars, but all eyes were about to shift to someone no one had noticed before. Tonight, a joke would turn into a reckoning, and a woman in a pink maid's uniform would remind the world what beauty really looks like. The grand ballroom of Evelyn Heights Hotel shimmered beneath a canopy of crystal chandeliers. The air was alive with the scent of roses and champagne, the murmur of designers and socialites blending into a polished symphony of luxury. The annual Fields Foundation Charity Gala was about to begin, the kind of event where elegance wasn't just expected, it was performed. At the edge of all this glamour moved Jane Washburn, the hotel's quiet housekeeper. Her pink uniform was crisp but unremarkable, a symbol of the many hours she spent cleaning up after evenings like this one. She moved between the rows of gilded chairs, adjusting the placement of name cards and polishing the mirrored pillars that would soon reflect the beauty of others. To most guests, she was invisible, a shadow in a world that only noticed the shine. Hit the subscribe button and turn your notification bell so that you can get more thrilling stories like this. Back to our story. Jane had been working here for nearly 3 years. The job was steady and paid enough to cover her tiny apartment and her mother's medication, but it was nothing like the dream she once carried. A dream of being on that runway, not sweeping beside it. That dream had faded long ago, dulled by rejection and the harsh reminder that not every kind of beauty was welcome in this world. Tonight, as the hotel prepared to host its most important evening of the year, Jane was simply here to make sure the hall looked perfect before the doors opened to the city's elite. The air shimmered with expectation. Gowns rustled, champagne flowed, and cameras were being tested for the photos that would soon flood society pages. As Jane polished the runway's edge, she caught her reflection in the glossy floor, a brief shimmer of herself in the same mirror that would soon hold the image of models and millionaires. For a moment, she straightened her posture, just slightly, a muscle memory from another life. But when a burst of laughter from the stylists echoed nearby, the moment broke. She dropped her eyes and kept cleaning. "Everything looking perfect, I hope?" came a voice that carried confidence like perfume. Melissa Fields, the hotel's CEO and tonight's glamorous host, glided across the ballroom in a scarlet gown that turned heads as she passed. Every movement of hers seemed to demand attention, and she was used to getting it. Jane stepped back, clutching her rag. "Yes, ma'am. Nearly done." Melissa's eyes flicked briefly over the maid's uniform before she smiled, the kind of smile that could cut if you looked too closely. "Good. We can't have any smudges stealing the spotlight tonight." As Melissa began greeting her guests, laughter and chatter filled the room again. Jane returned to her work, moving quietly between the lines of models now being ushered onto the stage for their final rehearsal. She didn't mean to linger, but the shimmer of the lights and the music, slow, confident, drew her gaze. She paused, just for a second, watching the models move like goddesses across the stage. "Careful, sweetheart," one of the stylists teased, noticing her look. "You'll be walking next if you keep staring like that." Jane flushed, but before she could retreat, Melissa's voice rose over the microphone, half playful, half condescending. "Actually, that's not a bad idea. Why don't we have a little fun before the real show? Come on, Jane, show us your best runway walk." The laughter that followed was immediate, bright, cruel, and echoing through the hall. Phones began to rise. The spotlight above the runway turned, bathing Jane in an unflinching light. For a moment, she wished she could vanish into the floor. But as she stood there, every eye on her, something inside her began to shift. Not shame, not fear, but a sudden, strange calm. Jane took a slow breath. The world around her, the laughter, the lights, the gleam of the ballroom, seemed to fade until all that remained was the echo of music and the memory of who she used to be. She stepped forward, and as she did, the room that had only ever seen her as background began to change, though no one knew it yet. Because before she was a maid, Jane Washburn had been something else. Someone who once dreamed of walking runways for real, before the world told her she wasn't the kind of beauty that people wanted to see. The laughter still echoed faintly in her ears, but it no longer stung. As Jane stepped back from the edge of the runway, the lights dimmed slightly, leaving her in a hush of shadows and shimmer. The gala's music drifted faintly through the air, the sound of violins tuning, the low murmur of elegance. But her mind was already far from that ballroom. For a moment she stood still, her hand resting lightly on the polished edge of the stage. The reflection of the lights scattered across her face like distant stars, and memory began to bleed into the present. Soft, bittersweet, uninvited. She was 17 again. The smell of hairspray and stage lights filled her nose, the sound of clicking heels echoing down the narrow hallway of a community theater where a local modeling coach held her weekly lessons. Back then, Jane's skin glowed with youth and possibility. She remembered the first time she walked that makeshift runway, her heart hammering like it wanted to burst free of her chest. Every step had felt like a promise, that maybe, just maybe, she could belong in a world that sparkled. Her coach, Miss Lorraine, had called her a natural. Chin up, shoulders back, glide, don't stomp. Let the floor feel you, not hear you, she'd said, her red heels clicking beside Jane's as they practiced. You've got elegance, darling. The kind they can't teach. But there had always been a pause afterward, a flicker of something unsaid behind the coach's painted smile. The same pause Jane would see years later on the faces of photographers, talent agents, and judges. You have the walk. You have the presence. But always a but. But your look isn't quite what we're after. But our clients are asking for something different right now. But we already have someone with your skin tone on the roster. They said the words kindly, but Jane heard the truth buried beneath. You don't fit the picture we sell. She had gone home that night and stood in front of the cracked mirror in her mother's hallway. The light flickered overhead as she practiced her walk again, this time without music, her bare feet whispering against the tile. She had imagined the lights of Paris, New York, Milan, all reflected in her eyes. She'd promised herself she'd never stop chasing that dream. But dreams, she would later learn, cost more than courage. They cost time, luck, and a kind of faith that was hard to keep when the world kept telling you no. By 19, Jane was juggling 3 part-time jobs and walking to casting calls between shifts. Her portfolio was a collection of printed photos in a plastic binder, worn at the edges from too many rejections. Each time an agent turned her away, she'd smile politely, step outside, and let the wind carry away whatever small piece of hope she'd lost that day. She never cried in front of them. She'd save her tears for the bus ride home, watching the city blur past, wondering why beauty seemed to have rules she could never meet. Then came the phone call, the one that ended all of it. Her mother's voice, weak and trembling, telling her about the diagnosis. The words, late stage, and hospital, and come home. The next morning, Jane didn't go to her modeling class. She sold the binder of photos, packed her small apartment, and took the first train home. The world of runways and flashbulbs faded behind her like a dream she'd outgrown. Years later, she could still remember her mother's frail hands reaching for hers in that dim hospital room. "You're my beautiful girl," her mother had whispered. "You don't need a stage for the world to see that." Jane had smiled, though the tears burned her eyes. "I'll be fine, Mama," she'd said. "Don't you worry about me." And she had been fine, mostly. When her mother passed 2 years later, Jane had found work at the Evelyn Heights Hotel through a friend. The uniform came with a small room, steady pay, and the kind of quiet where memories could hide. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. Predictable. She'd traded catwalks for polished floors and applause for the hum of vacuum cleaners. And for a long time, she'd convinced herself she didn't mind. But sometimes, when the ballroom was empty and the night shift was silent, she'd find herself drifting down the runway with her cleaning cloth in hand, pretending it was still her stage. She'd take a step, then another, slow, deliberate, graceful. Her reflection would follow in the polished marble, an echo of the girl she used to be. She never told anyone. It was her secret, the one piece of her old life she refused to let die completely. Tonight, standing once more in the glow of chandeliers, Jane felt that same ghost stirring inside her. The laughter from moments ago had faded into a background hum. What remained was the soft thud of her heartbeat and the whisper of memory urging her not to shrink this time. She moved to the far end of the runway, her cleaning rag still in one hand. The lights flickered as technicians adjusted the settings, casting a warm gold over the stage. Jane's reflection shimmered on the mirrored floor. A maid, yes, but also something else. Someone else. She lifted her chin slightly, almost unconsciously, and took one step forward. Then another. Her movements were small, almost imperceptible. But her body remembered. The angle of her shoulders, the gentle sway of her hips, the placement of her footfall. Her steps became smoother, softer, the years falling away with each motion. She reached the end of the platform and turned. A simple pivot, elegant, controlled. For a heartbeat, it felt like she was 17 again, standing under stage lights that burned with promise. Then a voice called out from the other end of the ballroom, breaking the illusion. "Jane! We need those tables cleared before the guests arrive." She blinked, the spell dissolving. "Yes, ma'am," she called back, quickly bending to gather her supplies. Her face burned with embarrassment, though no one seemed to have noticed. Or maybe they had, and chose not to say anything. As she stacked the cloths into her bucket, Jane's hands trembled slightly. Still enjoying the story? Like the video and click on the subscribe button. Comment below where you are watching from. Your support helps us to create more thrilling stories like this, and I am sure you wouldn't want to miss them. Back to our story. Outside, the faint hum of arriving cars signaled the beginning of the gala. Guests in gowns and tuxedos stepped into the lobby, their laughter drifting toward the ballroom. Jane exhaled slowly and gathered her things. There was work to be done, and she would do it, but deep inside, something had shifted. Something small, but unshakable. Because no matter how many uniforms she wore or how many floors she polished, a part of her still belonged to the lights. And tonight, whether she knew it yet or not, those lights were about to remember her. The night unfolded like a symphony of glamour. The chandeliers blazed brighter than ever, their crystal arms scattering ribbons of light across the marble floor as guests began to flood into the grand ballroom of Evelyn Heights Hotel. The air shimmered with movement, waiters gliding between tables, cameras flashing, and conversations bubbling with the careless laughter of people who had never known struggle. And at the center of it all stood Melissa Fields, queen of the evening. She wore red, not just any red, but the kind that demanded attention. Her gown draped elegantly around her figure, catching the light like molten wine. A diamond pendant rested against her collarbone, flashing each time she turned her head to greet another guest. She had the poise of a woman born to command a room and the confidence of one who never doubted that the room would listen. "Melissa, you've outdone yourself," purred an older man in a charcoal tuxedo as he leaned in to kiss her cheek. She smiled, accepting the compliment as her due. "Well, Harold, perfection is my only standard." Her laugh, soft, polished, calculated, rippled through the air. The photographers adored her. Every gesture she made seemed rehearsed yet effortless, from the way she held her champagne glass to the graceful tilt of her wrist as she gestured toward the floral arrangements lining the stage. Around her clustered the city's most powerful and beautiful. Executives, philanthropists, fashion magnates, and the latest social darlings who had bought their way into the glittering circle. It was Melissa's world, a stage of prestige where charm was currency and image was everything. Jane moved quietly through the edges of this world, her steps silent against the marble. The faint clinking of glassware and the rustle of gowns followed her like whispers. She was carrying a tray of freshly polished wine glasses to the back of the hall, staying small, unnoticed. But her eyes, always observant, caught pieces of conversation as she passed through the glowing crowd. She looks incredible. Fields always knows how to make an entrance. I heard she's expanding the foundation internationally. No one can touch her reputation. They say her new campaign is about redefining luxury. But between us, it's just a rebrand of the same old perfection. Jane said nothing, though she felt each word. The way people spoke about Melissa wasn't admiration, it was reverence. As though the woman in red were an emblem of what beauty and success were meant to look like. To Jane, Melissa was everything the world had always told her she wasn't. Polished, powerful, effortless. She had that magnetic grace that made people lean closer without realizing they were doing it. And yet, behind the surface charm, there was something cold in her eyes, something precise and controlled, as if Melissa saw the world not as people, but as parts of a tableau she alone could arrange. "Where's the lighting manager?" Melissa's voice carried over the hum of the room. "I want the focus softened near the main stage. These lights are too harsh. They make the centerpiece lose its tone." Her event manager scurried forward, nodding quickly. "Right away, Ms. Fields." Jane happened to be nearby, stacking folded linens when Melissa turned her way, eyes scanning the corners. What's your name again?" "Jane, ma'am." "Jane," Melissa repeated, tasting the name like it was a question. "Make sure the mirrored panels near the bar are spotless before the next wave of guests arrives. The reflection matters more than the glass itself, understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Jane said softly. Melissa smiled faintly, satisfied. "Good girl." Jane turned away before the heat could rise to her cheeks. "The reflection matters more than the glass itself," she repeated under her breath. The words stuck to her, a philosophy that perfectly summed up the woman who'd spoken them. As the evening progressed, the music swelled. Guests toasted the success of the foundation's charity work, though the true spectacle was the fashion show set to begin later that night. The models waited backstage, tall and exquisite, draped in designer gowns donated for the auction. Their laughter floated out like perfume, light and careless. Melissa glided through the room, her red dress flowing like a flame in motion. She shook hands, exchanged practice smiles, and posed for photos beside donors. Every interaction was flawless. To her, this wasn't just a gala, it was theater. Every detail was part of her narrative. The lighting, the flowers, the champagne bubbles catching the light. "Melissa, darling." A woman in silver sequins swept in for a kiss on both cheeks. "Your event is divine. Everyone's talking about it." "Of course they are," Melissa said, smiling as though the compliment were expected. "I wouldn't settle for anything less than divine." The laughter that followed was loud, brittle, and entirely approving. Jane, wiping down the mirrored wall near the entrance, glanced up briefly. From this angle, she could see Melissa framed perfectly in the reflection, radiant, commanding, her laughter bright as crystal. For a fleeting moment, Jane's gaze caught her own reflection beside the CEO's. Two women standing in the same world, yet galaxies apart. She looked away quickly. It was later in the evening, just as the crowd had settled into its rhythm, that it happened. Jane was making her way around the tables, collecting empty glasses and used napkins. The ballroom glowed with a warm haze of laughter and champagne. She moved quietly, blending into the background as always, until a guest, an older gentleman with flushed cheeks and a careless arm, gestured wildly mid-conversation. His elbow knocked against his glass, sending a crimson splash of wine arching through the air. Jane saw it too late. The wine landed across the hem of Melissa's red gown. For a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to freeze. Conversations faltered. Music dimmed into background static. Jane's heart slammed against her ribs as she darted forward, instinct taking over. Oh, I'm so sorry, ma'am," she said, grabbing a clean napkin and kneeling quickly. Melissa looked down at her, her expression unreadable at first, a flicker of disbelief, then irritation tightening around her mouth. The guests nearby shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to stare but watching all the same. "It's all right, Miss Fields," the man stammered, dabbing at his own cuff. "My fault entirely." But Melissa didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on Jane, who was gently blotting the fabric with trembling hands. Jane's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't see it coming." Melissa exhaled through her nose, a sound halfway between annoyance and composure. Then, with a smile so poised it almost looked kind, she said, "No worries, darling. I doubt anyone saw." Her tone was light, dismissive. A joke, maybe. But the guests had seen, every single one of them. And her words, though wrapped in silk, carried the sting of humiliation that sliced deeper than a reprimand ever could. A ripple of polite laughter passed among the nearby tables, the kind that wasn't about the joke at all, but about who had made it. Jane's fingers froze. She lowered the napkin slowly, her throat tight. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice barely audible. Melissa turned away with effortless grace, already smiling again at another donor. The moment, for her, was over. Forgotten. But for Jane, it clung to her like static. She rose silently, clutching the napkin to her chest. The laughter around her faded into a dull hum as she stepped back into the shadows of the ballroom. The night carried on. Glasses clinked, cameras flashed, and Melissa's laughter rose above it, all like a melody of control. She was flawless again, her composure unbroken, her image intact. No one would remember the maid's apology or the stain that had already been expertly dabbed away. But in the mirrored reflection along the wall, Jane caught a glimpse of herself, the faint outline of the woman on her knees, and the queen in red standing tall. For the first time, something inside her hardened. Not anger exactly, something quieter, sharper. The fragile beginnings of defiance. She finished her shift with mechanical precision, her movements steady, her face calm. But as she wiped the last table near the edge of the runway, she glanced up at the stage. The lights there had been adjusted just as Melissa had asked. Soft, golden, perfect. Jane watched their glow spill across the polished floor. Her fingers brushed the edge of the stage, the same place where she'd stood hours earlier, half dreaming of who she used to be. And for the briefest moment, she imagined herself not kneeling this time, but standing, head high, eyes steady, walking through those same lights with the quiet grace of someone who no longer asked permission to be seen. Outside, the city pulsed with neon and noise. Inside, the gala glittered on, a world of privilege spinning flawlessly under Melissa's rule. The queen in red had her kingdom, but the maid in pink had just found her resolve. And though no one noticed it yet, the night was already beginning to shift. Morning had long faded into a honeyed dusk by the time the ballroom transformed once more. Gone was the polite chatter of cocktail hour. In its place came the throbbing hum of preparation. Technicians adjusted lighting rigs. Photographers checked their lenses. Stylists shouted over the whir of blow dryers and the hiss of steamers. The long glass runway stretched across the center of the grand hall like a river of light, reflecting chandeliers and restless ambition. It was rehearsal hour, the heartbeat before the gala's grand reveal. Jane stood just beyond the glow, mop in hand, quietly working her way down the mirrored panels that lined the lower stage. The reflection of the models shimmered beside her as they strutted through practice runs. Long legs, deliberate turns, sharp poses. The sound of heels against glass echoed through the vast room like applause that had yet to be earned. "Angle your shoulders more," barked a stylist. "Chin up, darling. This isn't a funeral." The models laughed, tossing their glossy hair, perfectly at home in this world of scrutiny and shimmer. Their laughter, light and careless, carried across the ballroom and brushed against Jane like static. She tried to focus on her work. Wipe, rinse, polish. The same rhythm she'd done 1,000 times. But the lights, the runway, the music, they called something back. Something old. Something hers. The faint smell of foundation and perfume filled the air, mixing with the sterile tang of cleaning solution. Jane closed her eyes for a moment. She could almost hear her younger self whispering from the mirror of time, the girl who'd once practiced walks on tiled floors, believing one day she'd stand beneath lights just like these. She opened her eyes again. The world around her had moved on. The models laughed louder now. "Hey, careful there," one of them called out teasingly, watching Jane polish near the foot of the runway. "You'll outshine us if you keep that up." Laughter erupted, quick, effortless, and cutting. Jane looked up, caught off guard. The model's tone had that easy cruelty of someone who had never been dismissed a day in her life. Jane forced a polite smile. "Don't worry, miss," she said softly. "I only make the runway shine. You're the ones meant to walk it." The stylist nearby smirked. "Oh, she's got spirit. Maybe she does want to try next year. What do you think, ladies?" Evelyn Height's first housemaid turned model. The women giggled, half in jest, half in mockery. Their laughter seemed to bounce off the chandeliers. Jane's hands clenched around the handle of her mop. "I think she's shy," another said. "Come on, sweetheart. Give us a little twirl. Let's see your best model face." Jane straightened, feeling the heat rise up her neck. Her instinct was to walk away, just fade back into the quiet corners where she belonged. But before she could, a familiar voice floated across the room. "Now what's all this?" Melissa Fields. She approached like a queen surveying her court, red gown exchanged for a sleek, champagne-colored cocktail dress that shimmered with every movement. A crystal flute of champagne dangled from her fingers. The crowd of stylists and models instantly straightened as though her presence reset the atmosphere. "Nothing serious, Ms. Fields," one of the stylists said quickly. "Just some fun with the staff." "Fun?" Melissa's lips curled in amusement. "I do love a bit of fun before a show." Her gaze landed on Jane, standing by the edge of the stage, still holding her mop like a shield. Melissa's smile deepened, playful but edged. "And who do we have here? Our hard-working Jane, right? The one who saved the night after our little wine incident." A few of the women laughed. Jane felt her stomach twist. "Yes, ma'am," she replied quietly. "Just making sure everything's spotless before the event." "Spotless," Melissa echoed, swirling her glass. "A woman who appreciates perfection. Tell me, Jane, do you ever wonder what it feels like to be up here instead of down there?" Jane blinked. I just work where I'm needed, ma'am." Melissa tilted her head, enjoying the tension that rippled through the room. "Oh, come now. Every woman wonders, doesn't she? What it's like to have all eyes on her." The models chuckled softly, sensing where this was headed. Melissa turned to the crowd, her voice bright and amused. "Why don't we have some real entertainment before the rehearsal starts?" she said. "Jane, darling, how about you give us a little walk? Just for fun. Let's see what the maid's got." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel in volume, it was cruel in confidence. It rolled through the hall, echoing against marble and glass, the sound of those certain they were above. Jane froze. The world seemed to tilt, the light suddenly too bright, the air too thin. She felt every gaze land on her, curious, expectant, mocking. Somewhere near the sound booth, someone turned the music back on, soft and rhythmic, as if to underscore the absurdity. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. I don't think. Oh, nonsense. Melissa interrupted, smiling wider. We're all friends here. It's just a bit of fun before the show. Aren't you all curious to see if she's hiding some secret talent? The models giggled again. One clapped her hands like an eager spectator. Yes. Come on, Jane. Show us your walk. Jane's throat went dry. Her hand trembled on the mop handle. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to murmur an apology, to disappear, to vanish into the walls like she'd done her entire life. But something in the room shifted. Her reflection caught in the mirrored pillar beside the runway, the faint outline of her face, framed by that pink uniform. She looked small, yes, but behind her eyes was something fierce. Years of silence. Years of being underestimated. Years of burying who she was. Melissa stepped closer, lowering her glass. Her smile softened, though her tone carried amusement. Just one walk, Jane. We promise to applaud. There it was, the line between mockery and temptation. Jane swallowed. The laughter blurred around her. The music thumped softly in the background, bass notes pulsing like a heartbeat. She let go of the mop. The sound of the handle striking the marble echoed louder than it should have. A hush rippled across the room. Jane took one slow step forward, her shoes quiet against the glossy floor. She climbed onto the lower edge of the runway, not fully lit, not yet part of their stage. The models exchanged glances, smirking, ready for a show. Melissa leaned back slightly, intrigued. Oh, she's really doing it. The spotlight above flickered uncertainly, then steadied, casting a pale glow across the runway. Jane stood there, the light catching on her uniform's faint sheen. Her reflection shimmered beneath her, small but centered. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Every muscle screamed to step down. But instead, she took a breath, long, steady, deliberate. And then she walked. Not like a maid pretending to be a model. Not like a woman seeking approval. But like someone remembering who she had once been. Her first steps were small, hesitant. The laughter stirred again, soft snickers at the edge of the room. But then her shoulders lifted, her spine straightened, her gaze fixed on the far end of the runway. In her mind, she wasn't standing in Evelyn Heights anymore. She was 17 again, standing before a cracked mirror in her childhood bedroom, balancing on her mother's old heels, imagining flashbulbs and applause. The years fell away with every step. The laughter began to fade. Her movements grew fluid, poised, confident. Her arms swayed naturally at her sides, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. Each step hit the glass with precision, a rhythm that demanded silence. Someone near the back gasped. The crowd, once ready to laugh, found themselves unable to look away. Melissa's lips parted slightly, the smirk slipping. Her champagne glass hovered midair. Jane reached the center of the runway. The lights caught her face, soft, serene, glowing. Her pink uniform shimmered faintly, almost regal under the chandeliers. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. Jane turned. Slow, graceful, perfect. The pivot was flawless, instinctual, like a language her body had never forgotten. The silence that followed was unlike any she'd heard before. No one laughed. No one breathed. And as Jane stood at the end of the runway, eyes lifted, shoulders squared, she felt something crack open inside her. The years of rejection, the weight of invisibility, the buried dream, all of it unfurling into light. She exhaled. Her gaze flicked toward Melissa, whose expression was unreadable, caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to awe. The spell hung there, trembling. Jane didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply turned and walked off the runway, silent, calm, leaving behind a room that no longer quite knew what it had witnessed. And as she reached for her mop again, the faintest tremor of a smile touched her lips. The joke had ended. But the story, her story, had just begun. For several long seconds after Jane stepped off the runway, the ballroom was suspended in perfect stillness. It wasn't the kind of silence born of confusion or hesitation. It was the kind that descends when something sacred has just happened, when people find themselves holding their breath without realizing why. The air itself seemed to hum with what had just taken place. Jane stood beside the stage, her hand still resting over her heart. The faint scent of perfume and polished marble surrounded her, the music fading into memory. The mop leaned against the wall where she had left it, forgotten. Her chest rose and fell slowly, her breath trembling just enough to betray how much courage it had taken to stand there. She didn't look around at first. She couldn't. The air itself seemed to hum with what had just taken place. Jane stood beside the stage, her hand still resting over her heart. The faint scent of perfume and polished marble surrounded her, the music fading into memory. The mop leaned against the wall where she had left it, forgotten. Her chest rose and fell slowly, her breath trembling just enough to betray how much courage it had taken to stand there. She didn't look around at first. She couldn't. Her body was still buzzing with the echo of that moment, the lights, the stillness, the quiet thunder of her heartbeat. She could still feel the runway beneath her shoes, like it was alive, like it had become something other than glass and light, a bridge between who she had been and who she had just shown the world she truly was. Then, faintly, from somewhere in the middle of the audience, came a sound. A single clap. Soft. Unsure. Like someone had forgotten they weren't supposed to. The sound echoed through the silence, oddly loud in the vast room. Then, another joined it, two pairs of hands meeting in hesitant rhythm. Jane looked up. Near the front row, a woman in a silver gown had risen from her seat, her expression wide-eyed, her hands trembling as she clapped again. A man beside her followed, and then another. The sound began to swell, hesitant at first, like a wave gathering itself, then stronger, fuller, unstoppable. Clap, clap, clap. The noise built, rising into a storm of applause that filled every corner of the ballroom. It rolled through the audience like thunder breaking after a long storm. The laughter from before, that cruel, careless sound, was gone. What replaced it was reverence, admiration, awe. Jane's eyes widened, her throat tightening. She had imagined applause once, long ago, the bright kind that came after perfect walks, shining lights, and magazine covers. But this was different. It wasn't the applause of vanity. It was something deeper. It was gratitude. Someone shouted from the back, "Bravo!" A few others echoed the sentiment. Even the photographers who had been snapping mockingly before now raised their cameras again, this time reverently, the flashlights flickering like stars across the room. Jane blinked against the brightness. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she was still breathing. And then she saw Melissa Fields. The CEO stood near the foot of the stage, completely still. Her glass of champagne hung forgotten in her hand, her usual composure stripped away. The sharp poise that she had worn like armor all evening was gone, replaced by something almost fragile. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she simply stared, as though she, too, had just witnessed something she didn't quite know how to name. Slowly, Melissa set her glass down on a nearby table and began to walk toward Jane. The crowd's clapping softened as eyes turned to watch her cross the floor. The only sound left was the echo of her heels, click, 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 against the marble, steady and deliberate. Jane tensed. Her instinct was to step back, to disappear into the shadows again. She wasn't sure what Melissa wanted: approval, apology, or reclaiming of control. But when Melissa reached her, she didn't speak right away. She simply stood there, close enough for Jane to see the slight shimmer of tears in the woman's eyes. "Where," Melissa began softly, her voice hoarse, "did you learn to walk like that?" The question wasn't mocking. It wasn't amused. It was reverent, genuine. Jane's lips parted, but it took her a moment to find her voice. When she finally did, it came out quiet but steady, carrying through the hushed ballroom with the weight of truth. "I used to dream of being here," she said, her tone measured, calm. "Then I learned you don't need anyone's permission to walk like you belong." A murmur spread through the crowd, soft, awed. It was as if her words themselves carried a light that reached every corner of the room. Melissa's expression shifted again, something breaking open behind her eyes. She blinked quickly, but the tears finally fell, two perfect trails glinting down her cheeks. Behind her, someone began to clap again, louder this time. It spread faster than before, sweeping across the hall in a surge of emotion. Within moments, the entire audience was on their feet. A standing ovation. The models who had laughed before were clapping too, their mascaraed eyes wet, their perfect smiles faltering into something human. The stylists, the guests, the sponsors, all of them stood, united in the same astonished respect. Jane's heart felt too full. She wanted to shrink from the attention, but there was nowhere to hide. The light found her, no matter how much she'd spent her life avoiding it. Melissa took a step closer. "You were never meant to be invisible, were you?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. Jane looked at her, not with anger, but with quiet strength. "None of us are." Melissa let out a small, broken laugh that sounded like a confession. "God, I was so blind," she whispered. "I thought this gala was about beauty, about charity. But you," she gestured toward the runway, toward the place where Jane had just transformed humiliation into something transcendent, "you just reminded me what it really means." Jane lowered her gaze. "I wasn't trying to remind anyone of anything," she said softly. "I just wanted to stand up for myself, even if it was only for a few seconds." Melissa's eyes shimmered again. Sometimes a few seconds change everything. The applause swelled once more, echoing through the glass ceiling. It wasn't just sound now, it was energy radiating outward, connecting every person in the room to that single moment of truth. Jane felt it in her chest, that electric pulse of understanding. It wasn't just her victory. It was everyone's. Every woman who'd ever been told she wasn't enough. Every man who'd ever doubted someone's worth based on a uniform. Every person who'd been laughed at, overlooked, or underestimated. The ballroom wasn't laughing anymore. It was listening. Jane looked back at the runway, its polished surface still glowing under the chandelier light. It looked different now, not just a stage, but a mirror of transformation. The same floor she'd been cleaning minutes before had become her platform. Melissa turned to face the crowd. Her voice carried through the microphone still clipped to her dress, clear, trembling, yet commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her hand gesturing toward Jane, "tonight, something extraordinary happened here. We came to celebrate beauty, but I think we've all been reminded that real beauty has nothing to do with gowns or jewels. It's grace. It's courage. It's standing tall when the world tells you to kneel." The audience erupted again in applause. Some were crying now, quietly, discreetly, behind napkins and hands. Jane felt tears sting her own eyes. She hadn't wanted a scene. She hadn't wanted redemption or recognition. But something about hearing those words made her chest ache, like her younger self, that girl who used to dream, was finally being seen. Melissa turned back to her. "Thank you, Jane," she said softly. "You've just changed how I see everything." Jane managed a small smile. "You didn't have to change how you see me," she replied. "Just how you see yourself." Melissa blinked, her expression faltering again under the weight of those words. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded, as if conceding a truth she hadn't known she needed. The applause carried on for another full minute. It rolled and echoed, the kind that comes from people who know they've just witnessed something they'll remember for the rest of their lives. When it finally began to fade, the music returned, soft, instrumental, and strangely fitting. It wasn't the rehearsed track meant for the models. It was something deeper, slower, almost like a benediction. Jane stood quietly as Melissa guided her to the center of the stage. Together they faced the crowd, the maid and the CEO, side by side under the same light. For the first time, they looked like equals. Melissa reached for Jane's hand and lifted it gently. The applause renewed, stronger than ever. Flashbulbs exploded again, but this time, Jane didn't flinch from them. She smiled, small, humble, radiant. Because this time, she wasn't being laughed at. She was being seen. When the music finally died down and the applause softened into quiet murmurs, Jane stepped back, her eyes glistening but her voice steady. "Thank you," she said simply, "for letting me walk." The audience fell silent again, not because they were told to, but because they felt it was the only proper response. Melissa looked at her, her voice breaking as she replied, "No, Jane. Thank you for showing us how." Jane turned then, her eyes catching the mirrored pillars she had polished earlier. For a fleeting moment, her reflection shimmered in them, no longer that of a maid, but a woman who had rewritten her story. The hall lights dimmed slightly, signaling the official start of the gala. But everyone knew the night had already reached its highlight. The real show had already taken place. And the woman who had stolen it wasn't wearing diamonds or silk. She was wearing a maid's uniform, and grace that could not be taught. For a moment, no one moved. The applause had softened, but the energy in the ballroom still pulsed like a heartbeat, a living, breathing reminder that something unexplainable had just unfolded before them. The runway shimmered under the chandeliers, still glowing from the reflection of Jane's walk. The light hadn't faded from it, it had merely shifted, as if the stage itself knew it had been transformed. Melissa Field stood at the edge of that glass runway, her mind a storm of emotion she could barely control. 4 years, she had built her image on perfection. Precise events, flawless gowns, impeccable poise. She had trained herself to see the world in surfaces. Elegance, composure, refinement. But right now, looking at Jane, she felt as though every surface had shattered. The maid, the quiet, polite woman she had barely noticed in passing, had undone her without saying a single cruel word. Melissa blinked hard, her chest tightening as if her gown had grown too tight. She looked down at her trembling hands, at the champagne glass she hadn't realized she was still holding. It tilted slightly, and a single drop of golden liquid spilled onto the polished floor, catching the light like a tear. She set the glass aside. The applause still rippled faintly, like a tide drawing back. Jane stood a few feet away, still trying to blend into the background despite being the brightest thing in the room. The maids near the side doors peeked out in disbelief, eyes wide, as if watching one of their own step into a fairy tale. Melissa swallowed hard and took a breath. Her heels clicked softly against the glass floor as she climbed onto the runway. The sound alone was enough to silence the lingering claps. Heads turned, phones rose, and the crowd seemed to sense something important was about to happen, something that couldn't be planned, scripted, or rehearsed. Melissa walked slowly, almost reverently, toward Jane. Her reflection stretched beneath her, 2 women mirrored in light, one in couture, one in a uniform. When she reached her, Melissa paused. She had spent a lifetime knowing what to say, every speech, every toast, every polite response crafted with precision. But now, her throat burned with something that wasn't scripted. Something real. She took the microphone from its stand. Her voice, when it came, was softer than usual, and trembling. "Tonight," she began, the word catching for a second before she steadied herself. "Tonight, I thought I was hosting a gala." A murmur swept through the audience. Melissa drew in another breath, her eyes never leaving Jane's. "But what I realize now," she continued, "is that I was being taught a lesson. One that I, and maybe all of us, needed to hear." Jane's heart thudded painfully. She shook her head slightly, murmuring, "Please don't," but Melissa lifted a hand gently, silencing her. "I thought beauty was something we could measure," Melissa said, her voice carrying farther now, stronger but still tender. "Something we could dress, frame, and control. I thought it belonged to those who could afford it, those who fit into the narrow space that the world calls perfection." She turned slightly toward the audience, her tone deepening, growing more vulnerable. "But tonight, a woman reminded me that true beauty doesn't need a gown, or gold, or a name. It doesn't need permission to exist." She faced Jane again, and her voice broke, tears glimmering under the lights. "It just is." A hush fell over the room. The chandeliers flickered softly, like the night itself was listening. Jane stood motionless, her eyes wide. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her again, but this time, the attention didn't sting, it warmed. Melissa took a step closer, lowering her microphone slightly as if speaking only to her. "You showed me what grace looks like when it has nothing left to prove." Jane opened her mouth to respond, but no words came, only a breath that trembled like a confession. Melissa smiled faintly, her tears breaking free now, glittering down her cheeks like jewels. She turned back to the audience and raised her microphone once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steadier now but heavy with emotion. "Tonight, Evelyn Heights will remember something more important than any contract or headline. We will remember that beauty can be found in the courage to stand, even when you've been told to stay invisible." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. A few people were openly crying. Melissa continued, her voice gathering strength. "From this night forward, the Fields Foundation will begin a new initiative, one I'm calling Beauty Beyond Titles." The words seemed to hang in the air, electric and full of promise. It will be a campaign celebrating real women, not models, not celebrities, but the everyday women who work, who endure, who rise, who walk with quiet dignity through lives that the world too often overlooks. The audience erupted in soft applause, not thunderous, but sincere, steady, alive. Melissa's gaze drifted back to Jane. "And it only feels right," she said, her voice softening again, "that the first face of this campaign, the first woman to represent everything it stands for, should be the one who showed me what beauty truly means." Her eyes filled again as she spoke the words. "Jane Washburn." The sound of Jane's name rippled through the room like light breaking through clouds. There was a pause, then the applause began again, louder this time, joined by shouts of approval and scattered cheers. Jane's hands flew to her chest. "No, I can't," she stammered, shaking her head. "Ms. Fields, please, I'm just—" "You're not just anything," Melissa interrupted, stepping forward and taking her hands. Her grip was warm, trembling slightly. "You're the reason everyone here will remember tonight for the rest of their lives." Jane's eyes glistened. "I was only doing what I've always done," she said softly, "trying to stay out of the way." Melissa smiled through her tears. "And look what happened when you finally stopped." The crowd laughed softly, a sound full of affection, not mockery. It was the sound of hearts softening. Jane looked down at their joined hands, one adorned with diamonds, the other roughened from years of work. The contrast was sharp, but somehow, in that moment, it didn't feel wrong. Felt whole. Melissa raised Jane's hand gently, turning back to the audience. "This," she said, voice cracking slightly but strong with conviction, "is the real queen of the night." The applause exploded again, echoing through the ballroom, shaking the chandeliers. Guests stood, shouting Jane's name, clapping until their palms were red. Jane! 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 The chant rose and swelled like a wave, filling the grand hall with something pure. Admiration, yes, but also gratitude. Jane's tears finally spilled, silent but unstoppable. Her chest ached with disbelief, with awe, with release. The same people who had laughed at her minutes before were now on their feet because of her. Melissa leaned close and whispered, "Don't cry, darling. You'll make me cry even more." Jane laughed through her tears, a shaky sound that broke whatever restraint remained between them. Melissa stepped back, raising her microphone one final time. "Tonight," she said, her voice echoing through the room, "I learned that beauty isn't a performance. It's a truth. And sometimes it takes someone humble to remind us of it." Her gaze lingered on Jane. "You've reminded me." The two women stood under the chandeliers, the golden light catching the tears on their faces, making them shine like twin beacons. And then, slowly, Melissa began to applaud. Not as a CEO, not as the host of a gala, but as a woman who had just been humbled, moved, and remade. The rest of the crowd followed, rising once again. This time, the applause wasn't frenzied or chaotic. It was unified. It was human. Jane stood there, tears glistening on her cheeks, her pink uniform catching the light like silk. Her lips parted in a trembling smile. For the first time, she didn't try to hide it. She let the light find her. Melissa turned toward her one last time, her voice low but steady. "You walked tonight, Jane," she said softly. "But I think we all learned how to stand." The lights dimmed around them, leaving just one spotlight on the two of them, the Queen in red and the Maid in pink. And for once, they stood side by side as equals. Both changed, both seen. The room erupted once more, the sound of applause like a storm breaking open the night. And as Jane lifted her gaze toward the chandeliers, her tears shimmering in the golden light, she realized that this moment of unity, of redemption, was far more beautiful than any dream she had ever dared to imagine. The days that followed the Field's Foundation Gala felt like a blur, a bright, impossible dream that Jane kept expecting to wake from. But the dream didn't fade. It began with one video, a shaky 2-minute clip uploaded by a guest, the maid who stole the show. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. By morning, millions had watched it. The clip of a quiet maid stepping onto a runway, the cruel laughter melting into stunned silence, then into thunderous applause. By the end of the week, it wasn't just a video. It was a phenomenon. Fashion blogs dissected her poise and posture. Magazines called her the new face of authenticity. Morning shows replayed her walk with emotional commentary. Even late-night hosts joked about how a maid taught the fashion world how to really walk. But Jane Washburn barely saw any of it at first. Because at 7 a.m. the next morning, she still reported to work. She arrived through the staff entrance as always, her hair tied neatly back, her pink uniform freshly pressed. The hotel lobby was quiet except for the hum of vacuum cleaners and the faint sound of an espresso machine from the cafe. "Morning, Jane," called out one of the bellboys, grinning broadly. "Or should I say Miss Runway Royalty?" Jane laughed softly, shaking her head. "Don't start that, Peter. I've got more floors to mop than you have jokes." He chuckled, but his tone was warm, reverent. People had begun to look at her differently. Not just the guests, but the staff too. They no longer looked past her. They looked at her. Still, Jane moved through her tasks as she always had. Cleaning rooms, straightening linens, checking mirrors, polishing glass. But every so often, she'd catch her reflection in one of those mirrors, the same kind she had once wiped absent-mindedly, and pause. It wasn't vanity that made her look. It was wonder. Because every reflection seemed to whisper the same truth. You didn't imagine it. You really did that. By the end of the week, the hotel's management called an emergency meeting. Not because of a problem, but because of a miracle. Jane's name had brought more attention to Evelyn Heights than any PR campaign in years. Designers wanted to rent the ballroom for their next shows. Reporters wanted interviews. Guests wanted to stay, where the Maid made history. And Melissa Fields, the CEO herself, was at the center of it all. When Jane was summoned to Melissa's office, she walked in quietly, unsure what to expect. The last time they'd stood face to face, it had been under a spotlight. Melissa rose from behind her desk as Jane entered. She wasn't wearing her usual corporate armor. No sharp red dresses or diamond earrings. Today, she wore something simple, a soft cream blouse and black trousers. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes, unpainted. "Jane," she said, her voice gentle. "Come in." Jane hesitated at the threshold. "I hope I'm not in trouble, ma'am." Melissa smiled faintly. "The opposite, actually." She gestured toward the window. "Do you know how many calls I've had since the gala? From designers, journalists, even the mayor's office." Jane blinked. "The mayor?" Melissa nodded, her tone almost disbelieving. "He wants to feature you in the city's Women of Inspiration campaign." Jane laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes from disbelief. "Me? I clean rooms." Melissa shook her head. "No, Jane. You walked into a room and made everyone remember what real grace looks like." Jane looked down, suddenly shy. "I didn't mean to make a scene. I just couldn't stand there and let them laugh." Melissa's voice softened. "And that's exactly why you changed something." She leaned against her desk, her usual authority replaced by something warmer. "I wanted to talk to you before things get bigger. Because they will. The Beauty Beyond Titles campaign launches next month, and everyone wants to know more about you. They're calling you the symbol of a new kind of beauty." Jane frowned slightly. "I'm not a symbol, ma'am. I'm just a person who got tired of being looked down on." Melissa smiled. "That's precisely what makes you one." A silence settled between them, not awkward, but meaningful. Two women from different worlds, connected now by something beyond position or pride. "Finally," Melissa said, "I want you to take some time off. Not because I don't want you here, but because you deserve to see what you've inspired." Jane shook her head firmly. "No, ma'am. I'll stay. I want to finish the week. The ballroom still needs polishing for Saturday's event." Melissa laughed softly, shaking her head. "You really don't change, do you?" Jane smiled. "I think that's the point." By the following weekend, Jane's story had taken a life of its own. Magazines called her the Maid who walked with majesty. Fashion Week organizers invited her to attend as a guest. And the Fields Foundation officially announced her as the ambassador of the Beauty Beyond Titles campaign. The promotional photos were simple: Jane standing in her uniform, the same pink fabric pressed and immaculate, her chin lifted, her expression serene. The tagline read, "Beauty belongs to everyone." It was everywhere within days, on billboards, in online ads, printed across glossy magazines that once wouldn't have looked twice at a woman like her. But Jane didn't change her routine. She still woke up before dawn, still brewed her mother's tea, still tied her hair back neatly and showed up to the hotel on time. Sometimes she'd walk through the ballroom before it opened, just to stand where it had all begun. The glass runway had been taken down, but she could still feel it, the pulse of that night humming under her feet like a heartbeat in the floor. It was strange. The world now saw her as a story, an icon, an inspiration. But inside, she still felt like Jane, the woman who swept floors, who remembered her mother's laugh, who had learned to survive disappointment without bitterness. She carried the fame lightly, the way one carries a fragile thing that doesn't truly belong to them. A few weeks later, Melissa called again. This time, she wasn't inviting Jane to a meeting. She was inviting her as a guest of honor. The Fields Foundation was hosting a follow-up gala, a celebration of the new campaign. This time, Jane wouldn't be backstage or behind the curtains. She would be sitting in the front row. When the evening arrived, the ballroom glowed again, just as it had that night. Chandeliers blazing, crystal glasses gleaming, music drifting softly through the air. But everything felt different. Because this time, the walls themselves seemed to remember her. Jane entered through the main doors, not the staff entrance. The ushers greeted her by name. Guests turned and whispered. She could hear her name on their lips, not mockingly, but with admiration. She wore a gown tonight, a deep rose color that echoed her uniform, elegant but modest. She had resisted wearing it at first, wanting to stay invisible, but Melissa had insisted. "You deserve to be seen," Melissa had said. Jane smiled now at the thought. When she reached her seat, she froze for a moment. The view from the front was dazzling. She could see the runway, the stage, the polished mirrors she had once cleaned. And then she saw Melissa, radiant in a simple ivory dress, standing at the podium. Their eyes met across the crowd. Melissa smiled, a small, genuine smile that held no distance between them. As the evening went on, Melissa took the stage to speak. "Tonight," she said, her voice strong and clear, "we honor a woman who taught us that beauty isn't given by status or taken by circumstance. It's carried, with dignity, with grace, with courage." She turned toward Jane. "Please welcome our ambassador, the heart behind beauty beyond titles, Ms. Jane Washburn." The applause rose again, like it had that night, but softer now, warmer. Jane stood, her gown catching the light, and walked toward the stage. Her steps were calm, unhurried, still graceful, still sure. Melissa met her halfway and extended a hand. When Jane took it, the room seemed to exhale, the same maid and the same CEO, now side by side, not divided by hierarchy but joined by something deeper. As they stood together under the chandeliers, the cameras flashed, but Jane barely noticed. She wasn't walking for them. She was walking for the woman she used to be, the one who had polished floors and dreamed in silence. When the speeches ended and the music resumed, Jane excused herself for a moment and slipped away from the crowd. She wandered toward the back of the ballroom, where the lights dimmed softly near the service doors. There, hanging neatly on a rack, was her old uniform, pressed and folded, waiting. Melissa had insisted they keep it. As a reminder, she had said. Jane reached out and touched the fabric, her fingers lingering on the collar. It was just cotton. Simple, ordinary. Yet somehow it felt like silk. She smiled quietly to herself. That night, as she left the ballroom, she carried the uniform carefully over her arm, not as a symbol of shame, but as proof of where she had begun and how far she had come. Because she knew now that beauty wasn't in the applause, the headlines, or the lights. It was in the quiet, in the steady grace of doing your best when no one is watching. And as she walked through the grand hotel lobby, the chandeliers glinting above her, she realized that her walk, the one that had changed everything, had never been for the audience. It had been for her. Months passed, but the echo of that night never truly faded. It lived in the glint of chandeliers, in the soft shuffle of heels across marble floors, and in the hush that fell whenever Jane Washburn entered a room. Her story had become more than a viral clip. It had become a quiet revolution. The Beauty Beyond Titles campaign took root faster than anyone expected. What began as Melissa Fields' public apology and Jane's moment of grace grew into a global movement celebrating women who worked in silence, unseen yet essential. And at the center of it all was Jane. Every week, She visited community centers and youth programs, meeting young women who had been told they were not enough. Not tall enough, not fair enough, not rich enough, not the right anything. She never lectured. She just listened. Sometimes she'd stand before them, hands folded, wearing that same pink uniform that had once been her cage and was now her crown. "I didn't walk that runway to prove them wrong," she would say softly. "I walked it to remind myself that I was never wrong to begin with." The girls would sit in silence, eyes wide, absorbing every word. Because Jane didn't just speak, she embodied what they all longed to believe, that grace had nothing to do with permission. Back at Evelyn Heights, the rhythm of life continued. Events came and went. Guests arrived and departed. Yet something in the hotel had changed forever. The staff walked taller. The laughter in the halls had softened, less cruel, more kind. And in the grand lobby, framed near the staircase, hung a photograph that no one could pass without pausing. It showed Jane mid-step on the runway, her uniform glowing under the lights, her chin lifted, her eyes fierce and calm at once. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "Beauty Beyond Titles, Evelyn Heights Gala, the night Grace took the stage." Every morning, Jane would pass that photo on her way in. Some days, she'd smile. Other days, she'd feel her throat tighten with disbelief that the woman in that frame was her. But she never lingered long. There was always work to be done. One afternoon, Melissa called her into her office. It had been nearly 6 months since the gala, and yet the two women had grown close. No longer employer and employee, but something far more complex. Respect had replaced distance. Admiration had replaced pride. Melissa's office had changed, too. Gone were the glossy posters of supermodels in diamond gowns. In their place hung photos from the campaign, real women in their uniforms. Nurses, janitors, teachers, mothers. And right in the center, above the window that overlooked the city, was that single-framed image of Jane on the runway. "I still look at that every morning," Melissa admitted when Jane entered. "It reminds me of who I was that night, and who I want to be now." Jane smiled. "We've both walked a long way since then." Melissa laughed softly, shaking her head. "You walked. I'm still trying to catch up." They shared an easy silence, the kind that comes only when pride has been stripped away and honesty remains. "I wanted to tell you," Melissa said finally. "The foundation board approved the mentorship project. You'll head it, under your name." Jane froze. "Under mine?" Melissa nodded. "The Jane Washburn Initiative. It'll fund scholarships and creative programs for girls who've been turned away by modeling agencies, pageants, art schools, any place that tells them they don't fit." For a long moment, Jane couldn't speak. Her throat tightened as she remembered her younger self, standing outside an agency window, watching other girls being chosen. "Melissa, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Melissa replied, smiling. "Because you already said everything that mattered that night." The launch of the initiative was small, just a modest gathering in the same ballroom where everything had begun. But this time, Jane stood at the podium, not behind the scenes. Behind her, projected onto a screen, played silent footage from that unforgettable night. Her stepping into the light, the laughter, the walk, the silence, the applause. When she turned to speak, her voice was calm and clear. "I used to think beauty was something you had to earn, something other people handed out like an award," she said. "But I learned it's something you carry, whether anyone sees it or not." She paused, looking over the audience, a mix of young women, hotel staff, and foundation members. "They laughed when I walked," she continued quietly, "because they couldn't see what I already knew, that every woman, no matter where she stands, has the right to shine." The crowd erupted in applause, but Jane barely heard it. She felt peace, not pride, not vindication, but peace. Because she knew that her walk had never really been about her. It was about every woman who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or diminished, and had still carried herself with dignity. Later that night, after the guests had left and the lights had dimmed, Jane lingered in the empty ballroom. The stage was bare now, the runway gone. But when she closed her eyes, she could still see it, the shimmer of light on glass, the way silence had swelled like music, the weight of 1,000 eyes turning from mockery to awe. She walked slowly to the center of the room and stood there, just as she had that night. The air seemed to hum again, alive with memory. In her mind, she heard her mother's voice, soft, loving. "Don't let them tell you who you are, Jane. You were born to walk with your head high." Tears stung her eyes, but she smiled through them. Somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, the world moved on. More fashion shows, more faces, more lights. But this space, this quiet corner of her story, would always belong to her. She turned slowly, her body remembering the rhythm that had once stunned a crowd into silence. Her steps were slow, deliberate. No cameras, no applause, just the echo of her heels and the whisper of her breath. When she reached the end of the invisible runway, she pivoted gracefully, her signature turn, her silent statement. And in that moment, the years of rejection, the laughter, the humiliation, all fell away. There was only her, the maid, the model, the woman. In Melissa's office upstairs, the lights were off except for the glow of the city beyond the glass. The framed photo of Jane on the runway caught a flicker of moonlight. Melissa had stayed late, as she often did, staring at that image, at the poise, the quiet strength in Jane's eyes. That photograph had become her compass. Whenever she forgot why she'd changed her company's mission, whenever old habits of vanity or pride crept back, she'd look at it and remember the tears that had saved her. The tears of humility, the tears of truth. Down below, Jane stood alone on the ballroom floor, breathing in the silence one last time. The city lights glimmered through the high windows like distant stars. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the polished marble beneath her feet, a ghost of the woman she once was, standing beside the woman she had become. And then, with a soft smile, she whispered to the empty room, "Thank you." The words were not for anyone in particular. Perhaps for fate, perhaps for grace itself. She turned and walked toward the exit, her steps echoing softly in the vast space. And as the doors closed behind her, the light from the chandeliers spilled across the empty runway, that same stretch of floor that had once been her stage of humiliation and triumph alike. It gleamed now like gold, a symbol of every woman who had ever dared to rise. And when Jane walked, even the ones who once laughed had to rise, because grace, when it finally appears, demands to be seen.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.